our memories don't actually work the way many people expect them to, which is just as a recorder. This was a puzzle for cognitive scientists for a long time. Why would this very elaborate neural system not work so well? So our memories are not actually there to hold on to the past in some kind of objective way. They're really there to be bits of information that we can reassemble so that we can make sense of our present moment and anticipate what's going to come next. What was really intriguing to us is the finding you just mentioned, that their stories actually changed before their well-being improved. So we titled that paper Living into the Story, because it was as though people were narrating a new version of their lives, and then a week or two later, their mental health would catch up with that new version.
Welcome to the Performance Initiative Podcast.
Our goal is to provide you and ourselves with the tools to be the best versions of ourselves.
We are your hosts, Dr. Grant Cooper
and Dr. Zinovy Meyler. We just finished a conversation with Jonathan Adler.
Jonathan is a clinical psychologist. He's a professor of psychology at Olin College of Engineering. He's a senior lecturer at Harvard Medical School. He is the chief academic officer of the Health Story Collaborative and an editor of Personality and Social Psychology Review. And for us, Jonathan was a wealth of information about the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and how important that actually is.
Indeed, and how much it can play a role in your psychological well-being, even your health span, and the longevity.
There is so much that the way that we talk about ourselves to ourselves impacts our lives, the lives of those around us. There's so much to take away from this conversation. Please enjoy. Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation.
Oh, I'm so delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. You are one of the leading experts in the field of narrative psychology, and we were hoping we could start with the concept of memories. So when most people think about memories, I think that they think about basically memories work like a recording, like they took an iPhone recording and they're just playing it back for themselves. But in fact, that's not really how memories work. They're really more stories that we end up telling ourselves. And it turns out that the way we tell our stories to ourselves is really important, particularly for our sense of well-being, but for other things as well. And we really want to talk about how we can learn to tell ourselves better stories. But first, could you let us know, why are the stories that we tell ourselves so important?
Yeah. So that's a great place to start. It's for exactly the reason you just hinted, which is that our memories don't actually work the way many people expect them to, which is just as a recorder. So this was a puzzle for cognitive scientists for a long time. Why would this very elaborate neural system not work so well? And it turns out that because we don't have memory to sort of objectively hold on to the past, memory is there for other reasons. So I like to think about sort of our evolutionary history as a species, right? And, if you imagine, you walk by a cave and a bear jumps out at you, there might be something adaptive about remembering that cave and that bear. But what's actually going to be more useful to you is the idea that dark places might hide danger, right? That's going to be much more useful as you go about navigating the world. So our memories are not actually there to hold on to the past in some kind of objective way. They're really there to be bits of information that we can reassemble so that we can make sense of our present moment and anticipate what's going to come next. And the present and the future are never an exact replica of the past. So if we could only hold on to the past exactly as it happened, it actually wouldn't be that useful to it. This slipperiness of memory is a feature of the system, not a bug in the system. And so the form that those memories take, memories about ourselves take, are stories. That is sort of the tool that evolution has shaped for us as a species. And it turns out that stories are an incredibly effective and efficient tool for navigating the very complex social niche that we have as a species.
That's a really great way to put it. And I love all of those ideas. When we tell ourselves those stories, who is actually doing the speaking and who's listening?
Yeah, great. So we think about, I guess I'll back up just to say, we think about the collection of stories that we tell about our lives as what scientists call narrative identity. So narrative identity is the internalized and evolving story of the self, and it weaves together the reconstructed past, the perceived present, and the imagined futures. Those modifiers are there to recognize the fact that our memory is always this reconstructive experience. And yeah, as you hinted at, we have sort of two roles to play. We are the main character in these stories. Of course, these are stories about ourselves, but we're also the narrator. And so we often narrate those stories first to ourselves, but then we narrate them to other people. And actually, both before we narrate to ourselves and after we narrate to other people, our stories are always in dialogue with other stories out in the culture, be that sort of broad cultural stories or the individual stories of the people that we're telling our own lives to. So it starts to be this complex, dynamic process of self narration.
And it's a very interesting point in terms of the social structure of how narration is so important. And I'm sure you're familiar with Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*,
Yes,
where the whole idea that the reason that we became the dominant species is because of this very ability to narrate and push out the other species and prosper as a group rather than
exactly.
individual.
Exactly.
So
Yeah, the philosopher Daniel Dennett writes about each species' sort of signature adaptation. And he talks about, snails extrude shells and spiders spin webs and humans tell stories. It's the thing that we do that evolution has shaped for us. And it's an incredibly powerful tool. It is one of the reasons that our species has become so dominant. Stories aren't objective, but they are really effective at distilling the things that are important for the social arrangement of our species.
and how does that concept of the narration as being able to pass on the knowledge among ourselves, so sort of across our culture, but also down to the next generation.
Yeah.
How does that translate then into the individual narration?
Yeah. So I'll take each of those pieces because I think there's separate and important things to say about the sort of broad cultural piece, but then also the next generation piece. So at the broad cultural level, we scientists in my world talk about a narrative ecology, right? That there are all these stories that we are born into, that we inherit, both from our families, but also from our culture, and that some of those stories are incredibly potent, and powerful stories, even if they're often invisible. So we call those master narratives. And that name was chosen, I think, purposefully, quite provocatively, to suggest that we are, in a certain way, at the mercy of these stories that exist in our culture. And of course, we all exist in many cultural contexts. So there are stories about what it means to be an American, for example, or a man, or a person of color, et cetera, et cetera. And we are often those stories are invisible to us, but they are ubiquitous and they're very powerful. And there are consequences for not being able to narrate your own life in a way that aligns with the dominant narratives in our culture. What that also means is that every time we tell our own story, we have an opportunity to intervene in these broad cultural stories. And that, in fact, the only way these broad cultural stories change is by receiving the individual stories of people who are sort of pushing on the categories that are out there. So I'm happy to say more about that, but that's how I think in a nutshell about the cultural piece. And then the intergenerational piece is really important. It's ironic that this tool that evolution has shaped for us as a species is not evident at birth, right? We are born without words, let alone stories. So it's a tool we have to learn how to use. And our parents and caregivers play a really key role in shaping how that unfolds. I'll give you one example. I have a colleague at Emory University named Robin Fivish, who's very interested in the way stories play out in families. She's particularly interested in the gendered ways in which they play out. And she has this series of studies where she shows that all parents, tend to tell their little boys stories about what happened to them, and their little girls stories about how they felt about what happened to them. So they might say to the little boy, "Remember we went to the zoo? Ooh, and we saw the tiger." And they might say to the little girl, "Remember how scared you were of the tiger at the zoo?" And so those are different narratives. They have different building blocks. And so when those children develop the cognitive maturity to be the narrators of their own lives, they have learned very different things about what's supposed to go into one's narrative. That is one way in which sort of the gendered master narratives infiltrate our individual lives. Um, and my husband and I have two elementary school aged kids, a boy and a girl. And as a direct result of Robin's research, when we're putting them to bed at night and talking through their day, we're really careful to tell them both what happened and help scaffold their description about how they felt about what happened, because we want them to have as broad a narrative toolbox as possible when they become the narrator of their own lives.
Oh,
So
that's
this
amazing.
narrative transmission happens at the cultural level, and it happens at the sort of micro level within families.
Yeah, as someone with a boy and two girls, um, I never was aware of of how different just the storybooks are that are
Yeah.
geared towards boys
Oh,
and girls are so different.
yeah.
I found myself when I was reading like Cinderella, I would be changing some of the story because I didn't
Yeah.
like, she walked in and she saw the prince and they fell in like, no, no, no. They had a nice conversation. They were, and you just,
Right.
and so in a way about the narratives, like we were hoping, we'll get into how we can learn to tell ourselves better stories, but in a way also it sounds like we need to be wary, or maybe think of it differently. We have the opportunity to help our children and those around us learn to tell better
Exactly.
stories. And the
Exactly.
sooner that we start with that, the better.
Oh, yes. I also experienced the extreme gendering of children's literature. And before our kids were old enough to look over our shoulder and read along, we would sometimes change pronouns in stories, just be like, why is this bear a girl? Right? Like, why couldn't this bear be a boy? Why is this a gendered story?
Right, right,
Um,
right, right.
yeah. And certainly, our kids have two dads. There are very few children's
Yes.
books that have stories like ours. So that was an opportunity. We went and found, we have all of them. There aren't many of them. It was also an opportunity to talk about,
Yeah.
why aren't there stories about families like ours, and why is our family something to be celebrated and, feel proud of, even though it doesn't show up
As an
in
aside, that
children's
seems like a
stories.
growth market.
It
That seems like an
definitely is.
opportunity for a
Please, someone
publisher.
write more children's stories that are not, I
Right,
have two daddies. I love both my daddies, right? Like, no one wants to read those stories, even toddlers. They're boring stories.
right, right,
We
right.
need stories that have broader representation, where the broader representation is just
It's in the
incidental.
background. It's just
Um,
there, but it's not the focus.
there's a little more for older kids. My son got really into a series by the actor Neil Patrick Harris,
Hmm.
called The Magic Misfits, that is about this group of kid magicians who go off and do cool things, and one of them happens to have two dads, which is kind of irrelevant to the plot, but is a really important inclusion there.
Right, right.
So yes, I think it's an
The kids get
opportunity and a responsibility, that if we think about identity as a story, then the stories that we put out into the world provide the templates. They are the narrative ecology, for other people. And so if we want that to be a like diverse and thriving ecology, I really mean that in like an ecological sense,
yeah.
then we need all kinds of stories out there.
The idea of the story, the narrative existing ubiquitously, just like you said, is kind of fascinating, and the fact that we're, well, for the most part, are not aware of it. It's this 70,000 years ago, this crazy cognitive revolution happens, and yes, we start to dominate. We, as in the species, start to dominate, and now it just becomes sort of this in the background tool that we don't know how to use, and now it comes to the foreground, and now we're learning how to use it and the fact that it is actually useful. So I think this is a great segue to start talking about what we know and how we know what we know in terms of studies that support the
Yeah,
use of
sure.
narrative.
Sure. So I'll give you the high level, and then I'm happy to go in whatever direction you want.
Sure.
So yeah, the science of narrative identity is really become sort of a thriving, robust area of research in the last, I'd say, like 4 decades. So it doesn't have a long history, compared to other sciences, but it has really taken off. And so what narrative scholars tend to look at are the ways in which, people construct their stories. So yes, people are interested in content, like what happens to you. But what tends to be most interesting and compelling, and also sometimes most invisible to us, is that the way we tell our story is what really matters. So it's not so much the content of what happens to you; it's the way you narrate what happens to you that matters. And so while there's research on all kinds of aspects of stories, the heart of the field these days is really interested in themes, the way people are constructing the stories. And those are things people are often not paying attention to at all.
What are the better ways that, like, how should we be aspiring to tell our stories?
Yeah. I mean, so I would be really hesitant to have a one size fits all approach.
Sure. Sure.
So what I think the insight that I would want to share universally is the notion that you are not just the main character in your story, but also the narrator, right? I think often just that revelation is empowering to people to realize that it's not just what happens to you, but the way you make sense of what happens to you that really matters. And so there are a suite of themes that have been looked at over the years, and I'm happy to give you some examples of those. But I will say that, stories are cultural products, and therefore the scientific literature is bounded by the cultural context in which it's unfolded, right? So, which is mostly the United States and Western Europe. There's some really interesting, emerging work from areas in the majority world, but it is the volume of it is nothing compared to what's been done in Western context. So I'm happy to talk about some of the key themes that have been identified, with the caveat that these exist in Western cultural contexts where particular kinds of storylines dominate.
Friends, we hope you're finding value in the content. If you're enjoying what you're watching, please consider hitting the like button, help us with our YouTube algorithm, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on the notification button to stay up to date with everything going on in the channel. Something that was really interesting to me from some of the things that you've talked about before was the idea that when people are, I think it was a study where they were looking at people with depression and they were going through psychotherapy, and before they started to feel better, they were actually, you were able to look back and say, okay, they're actually changing their narrative story theme. And then a few weeks later, you would see them actually, would actually catch up.
So that was my dissertation.
That's a dissertation. Oh, okay, good.
So and it was more than just depression. So throughout my career, I've been really interested in sort of the messy real world. I've done nothing in the rarefied confines of the lab. I'm really interested in how stories play out in the real world. So what we did in that study was we partnered with a major outpatient psychotherapy clinic in Chicago. And we enrolled all people who were seeking all adults, so 18 and up, and all people seeking individual therapy, so not couple therapy or family therapy, but they were actually coming for a huge range of things. So there was depression. We had someone in our sample who was pregnant and wanted to sort of work through some things before becoming a mother, all the way up to real significant, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, all that kind of thing. And they were in treatment, all individual treatment, but for all kinds of issues with all kinds of treatments. So some was sort of manualized cognitive behavioral therapy, some was more integrative therapy, some was family systems therapy. So what we did is, before they started seeing their therapist, we got their stories and we used standard questionnaire-based measures of mental health. And then in between each session, they wrote stories about their lives and filled out these same questionnaire measures. And so what that allowed us to do, one thing that's wonderful about the field of narrative identity is that the research exists in both qualitative and quantitative modes. In that particular study, we were looking at a set of themes, and we did assign them quantitative values. And if you want to get wonky, I can talk to you about how we did that. But what that enabled us to do is to quantitatively plot the trajectory of people's stories alongside the trajectory of their mental health. And you get these really messy scatter plots. And so you have to use statistical techniques for figuring out what the relationship between these trajectories are. And what we found was, first, people got better over the course of therapy, which decades of research on psychotherapy research suggests that it works. So we expected to see that. And then we found changes in the themes in their stories over time. And then what was really intriguing to us is the finding you just mentioned, that their stories actually changed before their well-being improved. So we titled that paper "Living into the Story," because it was as though people were narrating a new version of their lives, and then a week or two later, their mental health would catch up with that new version.
And the interventions were they at all aimed at changing the narration?
No, no, these were all kinds of therapies for all kinds of problems. So no, none of these were sort of an explicit narrative therapy. There is an approach to therapy called narrative therapy where you write letters and your therapist edits them and stuff. That's not what this was. This was understanding how people's stories unfold over the course of therapy, whatever the intervention was. And some of those interventions were, exposure therapy for dog phobia was one of
Right.
our participants. So it's like progressively getting closer to dogs. Others was like, let's talk about your childhood and the way that set up relational patterns that you're still living out. So none of the therapies were explicitly trying to change people's stories.
Did the narrative actually change before people were more comfortable getting next to dogs? Was that,
I'd have to go back and look at the data set.
that would be amazing.
Particular participant, that was one participant. I don't remember.
Okay.
Was there any, have you noticed any kind of correlation between the type of therapy that was done that changed the narrative more than others?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what's interesting from the psychotherapy literature is that therapists are very attached to their theoretical orientation and clients are very unattuned to it. Um, so we did exactly that analysis because I knew there would be clinical psychologists who wanted me to show that X type of therapy was better at this, and there weren't. So we had the therapists also fill out questionnaires where they sort of checked a box about what type of therapy they were doing, but they also described their therapeutic intervention approach so that we could sort of cross-reference it with their check mark. But they also described things like how much did the client change and things like that. And no, there were no associations between what type of therapy you were in and this overall trajectory change.
That's great and disappointing, I'm sure, for those.
Yeah,
For those
there's a
therapists.
in the psychotherapy literature, there's an effect called the dodo bird effect, which it comes from Alice in Wonderland, and I'm going to get the quote wrong, but it is something like at the end of the croquet match where they're using dodo birds as the croquet mallets, the queen or whoever says, like, everybody wins, everyone gets prizes. And there's this
Oprah
effect.
car.
Yes, exactly. And so there's this effect in the psychotherapy literature that suggests it works. And there are forms of therapy that work better for certain forms of problems. So for example, if you have a specific phobia, I would say go do cognitive behavioral therapy because that's going to work better than, talking about your childhood relationships. But across the board, a lot of psychotherapies keep proving to be sort of equivalently effective.
So it's sort of like there's a general effect for people get better in different kinds of therapies, but interestingly for our conversation, that inspires them presumably to start telling better,
Exactly.
more productive stories.
I think
which
about
then
narrative as a metaphor for the therapeutic endeavor, that like whatever it is you're doing in therapy, underneath that, you're revising and reworking your story.
Mhm.
And so again, even when no one, client or therapist, is explicitly thinking about the story
Right.
is where the changes actually show up.
I mean, it definitely begs the question, are there ways to help people more specifically target a more productive story,
Yeah,
which may be a more streamlined approach if that's the kind of
right, right. So
the switch.
there are very, very few intervention studies in the narrative identity literature. And I think that is partially because those of us who study narrative identity believe that it really matters. And so it's very high stakes to think about purposefully intervening in someone's story when we don't know what the effects are. Just sort of from an ethical approach, we don't want to assign someone to the narrative control group. Or we don't want to, undertake a narrative intervention that we're not sure is going to actually help people. So there are very few experimentally done,
Yeah.
randomized controlled trials comparing one narrative intervention to another. And, you know, the randomized controlled trial is sort of the gold standard of intervention research. And so it would be interesting to see those, but I don't want to do that study either. I worry about the ethics of doing that study. And there's such an accumulation of other naturalistic evidence to suggest that people's stories change over time. And we can look at the relationship between the changes in their narrative identity and their changes in their well-being over time. That feels good enough to me.
Yeah. Well, and it may be that if you identify specific types of narrative changes, then you could gear interventions to help people achieve those kinds of narratives, maybe
Exactly.
specifically in a more targeted fashion,
In a
So
way
I
like a
work
pivotal
really
point?
closely.
like a pivotal point.
Yeah.
I work really closely with a nonprofit organization called Health Story Collaborative, where we've taken the psychological literature on narrative identity and developed programs aimed at helping mostly medical patients. We sometimes work with medical providers too, who are suffering a lot these days, um, to try to help them tell the story of their experiences with illness and healing. And again, those are applied programs. We're not doing research on them, but we are attending to the suite of themes for which there is strong scientific evidence and working with people in a dynamic way as opposed to a like a randomized controlled trial where you would say, now try it like this,
Yeah.
right, in a more dynamic relational way to help them tell stories that are going to support their well-being, even in the context of really challenging medical experiences.
It's a great segue to a study that, as doctors, we were both really interested in
Sure.
the study that I think this was your research, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong
Yeah.
about that one, that people that had more productive narratives about themselves when they got sick were able to handle the sickness,
Yeah.
with greater sense of well-being than
Yeah.
those that didn't.
Yeah, so I'll give you the high level of that
Please.
study too. So that was a big collaboration with a big team, but one of my colleagues had this really very large nationally representative data set. And so what that enabled us to do was to sort of pull out a natural experiment from the data. So these were midlife adults assessed every 6 months for several years. And so what we did was we pulled out a group of people who between the first time they engaged in the research and the second time, 6 months later, received a major physical illness diagnosis. So things like cancers, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, really significant medical diagnoses. And because the sample was so large, we were able to pull out a matched sample. So if we had a 56-year-old African American college educated woman with breast cancer, we could also pull out a 56-year-old college educated African American woman who stayed healthy, right? So it's sort of a
So
natural
that's
response.
a huge
And
sample
in the
size.
study, we had at that first time point, so before anyone has gotten sick, we had their stories and we had a bunch of measures of their mental and physical health. And then each 6 months later, we got additional measures just of their mental and physical health. And so what we found was that among the people who got sick in their physical health, some of them got better, some of them got worse, some of them sort of plateaued. But the best predictor of their mental health over the course of those years was the story they were telling before they got sick, right? So our stories not only serve as this foundation for holding on to the past, they also serve as a lens that we use for making meaning of new experiences. And so what we surmised in that study is that people with particular thematic configurations of their lives before they ever got sick had a tool or a lens for making sense of this new health challenge that would support their well-being, whatever happened to their physical health over the course of several years.
That's very interesting. But speaking of, you mentioned the fact that it had a significant effect on their mental health, but whatever happened to their physical. But another study that intrigued us really is the one on chronic stress and the telomere.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you could
So
speak to that.
that's another. So my colleague Ashley Mason at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, headed up that study. And Ashley is a stress researcher and brings a sort of biopsychosocial perspective. So she had a sample. These were all. So it was a sample of parents. Half of the parents had a child with quite significant autism spectrum disorder, so quite stressful. The other half had neurotypical children, still stressful, but not as stressful. And we had their stories, and then they were followed over 18 months, and we had measures of their psychological well being. And we also had a biological measure of what's called their telomeres. So, telomeres are like the end caps on our chromosomes, and as our chromosomes divide, the telomeres degrade. And people often talk about telomeres as sort of a biological marker of stress response or even aging, because over time they're going to naturally break down. And yeah, what we found was that the parents who were telling a certain kind of story about their experience as parents at time one had less telomere shortening than the other parents, even in this chronically stressed group over time. So I think that is the only um, study that has connected narratives with biological markers. And it was a small pilot study, sort of a first foray. So, all good science needs replication. There hasn't been a
Really
replication
exciting.
study of
Yeah.
that yet, but it was a really interesting finding that it was not that the way they told their stories not only affected their psychological well-being, but that there were biomarkers
Yeah.
to
That's
differentiate it.
amazing.
Yeah.
Has anyone ever gone back at that's huge sample size and looked at the people who tell more productive narratives? Are they less likely to get sick into the future? I mean, I think that would be a really interesting
That
thing
is
to
a
look
really good
at.
question. I haven't, and I can ask the rest of the team. It was a big team that worked on that study.
Yeah,
I don't
congrats,
know.
students. Let's get working.
Yeah, yeah, sounds good.
I think that
Thank
would,
you.
right,
My
because
next study.
there's a, it would make sense that it might, right? It would
Yeah.
be
Oh, yeah.
really, that would be kind of incredible
Yeah.
as well. Um,
So
how to make a better story.
yeah, so let's dive into
Yeah,
the idea of what makes a better story, or
Yeah.
how do we
are
tell
there
it?
certain principles, I guess?
Sure. So again, I want to again just contextualize this culturally, right? There isn't such a thing as a universal story because stories are cultural products, and so it it's what works for you in a particular context. Um, and again, better. The question about better is better for what? So my focus has always been about the connection between narrative identity and our psychological well-being. So I'll do the 2-second version of psychological well-being because there's a vast literature on what is psychological well-being. The very short version is that it sort of breaks down into two broad domains, which get their cumbersome names from Aristotle. So one is called hedonic well-being, which means it feels good, and the other is eudaimonic well-being, which means it feels meaningful. And those two domains of well-being are different from each other. And we can think about, if we think about our lives, we can definitely come up with things we do that feel good, but don't feel particularly meaningful, right? Like we might binge watch TV or eat chocolate or whatever, and that feels good, but doesn't feel meaningful. And then we can also all, I think about things that feel meaningful that don't feel that good. So there are different narrative pathways to those two types of psychological well-being. Um, so again, the key aspect of narratives that seems to be most strongly related to our psychological well-being broadly are the themes that we use in telling our stories. So I'll walk you through some of those themes.
Please,
Please,
yes.
yes.
Okay. So the first set of themes that is important to talk about they get called agency and communion, and people have written about them as the superordinate themes in life stories, meaning basically all life stories have these themes. So agency is a quality of the self. It's sort of the character of you trying to navigate your life. And are you more in the driver's seat of your life, or are you, batted around by the whims of external forces? And again, no one is objectively in control of their lives all the time. These are stories, these are narrative reconstructions. So we're not talking about truth here. But are you able to tell stories where you're sort of driving the plot or proactively respond when negative things happen to you? And then communion is the quality of our relationships, right? So stories are not just about you, they're about you in relationship with other people. And high levels of communion are stories about sort of loving, reciprocal, nurturing relationships. And lower communion stories are more about isolation and disconnection. So that's one set of themes. As you might expect, both agency and higher levels of agency and communion tend to go along with higher levels of well being. So we talk about those as sort of motivational themes. What are you motivated for? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to do in relationship with others? Another category of themes that for which there's a lot of research are affective themes, themes about the emotions in our stories. And yes, happy stories tend to be good for you, and sad, mad, anxious stories tend to not be great. But what's really interesting are the ways in which we sequence our emotions. So there's sort of a signature pair of affective themes called redemption and contamination. So in redemption stories, things start bad and end good, and contamination stories, things start good and end bad. Now, All lives have good and bad in them. So this is really about where you draw connections between things. It's about where you parse the chapter breaks of your life. It's not, again, about objective truth. This is a thematic way of constructing your life. And not surprisingly, high levels of redemption, low levels of contamination tend to go along with better well-being than the reverse.
I love the idea about the brackets, by the way. That's what you're talking about there. Like, where do you start and stop the story you're
Exactly,
telling?
exactly. Because you can take the same story and chop it up in different ways, and it can shift between being a redemption sequence or a contamination sequence.
Right.
I'll give one example from my research. Um, this is a real person's story uh, that showed up in their life story. The plot of this story is a man tells the story of the first date that he goes on with the woman that he ultimately goes on to marry. And in the story, they go out on the date. He brings her home. They're standing on her front porch. He leans in to kiss her goodnight, and just then her dad pops out onto the porch, and it's terribly embarrassing. So, in the contamination version of this story, they've had this wonderful date that gets contaminated at the end. And yeah, even though, of course, we went on to get married, there's always been this stain at the beginning of our relationship. That first date wasn't good. The redemptive version is we had this really embarrassing thing happen on our first date, and it was, the source of connection, and we laughed about it later on. And neither one of those stories is more true than the other. They're different ways of narratively reconstructing the same plot. And those different narrative constructions really matter for our mental health. I want to just tell you about one other theme because the four that I've told you about so far, agency, community, and redemption, contamination, largely go along with hedonic well-being, a sense of feeling good. That's not entirely true. Redemption seems to go along with eudaimonic well-being as well. But a theme that seems to be predominantly associated with eudaimonic well-being or a sense of meaningfulness is a theme that we call exploratory processing. And that is the extent to which you sort of get in and work with your story, especially the challenging parts in your story. So some people sort of rush to resolve negative things and it's all wrapped up. And I know what that's about. Let's move on. And other people sort of spend a while excavating the meaning of whatever the challenging experiences in their lives are. And that search for meaning is itself associated with positive eudaimonic well-being. So it doesn't always feel good to get in there and really work through the negative things that happen to you, but it can lend your life a sense of meaning. And that meaningfulness is part of your well-being. It's really important. In my work with Health Story Collaborative, we sometimes work with patients who have terminal illnesses or really severe chronic illnesses. And sometimes they feel like, redemption, not an option. Agency, can't do it. But
Hmm.
this search for meaning, this exploratory processing, that is available to everyone. And that folks, even when they feel like happiness itself, feeling good, that's not an option for me given what's going on in my life. But feeling meaningful, yeah, I can do that. So I think it's important to remember that when you said like, what's the route to better stories? It depends what you're shooting for in your story. And of course, the dream is that it feels both good and meaningful, but that might not be available to everyone.
Seems like staying on something really difficult and looking for meaning inside of it, on the one hand, can be so powerful, like you were just saying. But it seems like a real fine line between that and perseverating and just,
Yeah, or
staying in a dark
rumination.
thought because, it's sort of allowing yourself to stay there because you think you're searching for meaning and really you're just perseverating.
Yeah.
How do you parse that? Is there a
Yep.
way to parse that?
So yeah, again, in the psychotherapy literature, we talk about rumination, where people have these negative thoughts that just keep cycling through their mind. And if we were to quantitatively code exploratory processing, that kind of rumination or perseveration wouldn't score very high, actually. People sort of working through the same thing over and over without there being any progression is not going to look like exploratory processing. And it's hard. It is hard work, right? This is not easy work. This is in many ways the work of psychotherapy is to try to make sense of those difficult experiences in pursuit of meaning. But I think when people get stuck, they're not doing exploratory processing.
Right.
They're stuck. They're ruminating.
What are your thoughts on logotherapy stemming from the book of the Man's Search for Meaning.
Right. So I don't know a lot about the specific techniques of logotherapy, though Viktor Frankl and, Man's Search for Meaning is an incredibly influential and important book. I think so. Again, psychotherapists tend to be very attached to their theoretical orientation. So there are the people who say, I'm a logotherapist. I do what Frankl prescribed. And that's very meaningful for the therapist.
For the simpletons in the discussion, what's logotherapy?
Yeah. You probably can define it better than me.
I don't know that I can, but it stems from Frankl's book Man's Search for Meaning, and Viktor Frankl was a psychologist who went to the concentration camp, and he was writing his manuscript, and that manuscript was his life's work, even in the time when his whole family was exterminated, and that was actually confiscated and destroyed, and he kept working on it as his purpose in life, and his way of persevering through that, through the experience of the concentration camp, was that meaningful.
I see. Yeah.
Meaningful way.
Yeah.
So now there's sort of a set of therapeutic practices that derive from Frankl's book, and I didn't receive any training in that. But I do think that search for meaning is certainly in service of eudaimonic well-being.
Look, if you don't mind, I just have a quick question regarding the question of agency.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting concept in storytelling, because if you go back to stories in general, and you think of any cultural stories such as the Greek mythology, the idea of a hero, and the idea that the hero just does what they need to do, and then there is the fickle gods, and there is only so much that us as humans can do. Or a story of Job, where what happens to Job, and regardless of the fact that he was devout and so on. So in some ways, if you think about agency, and that could be so dominating without allowing for the fickle gods or Locke or whatever you want to call it. So how does one balance that? And of course, well, okay.
I love that question.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
So what's interesting is that the stories that you've referred to, the Greek myths and the Bible, are written in a pre-novel era, right? The novel is an invention of the late 18th, early 19th century. And the radical intervention was the shift towards an interiority, right? The novel is not just about the sequence of events like an epic is. The novel is about what the individual character experiences and feels. And that is not the kind of story that dominated ancient Greece or, early biblical contexts. And we don't live in those contexts anymore. So we don't tend to live out our lives in the form of an epic. We have a much more novelistic approach to our lives. And so agency is going to play out differently in those different genres of, dominant cultural stories. Now, what you're saying is right. Nobody has complete agency over their lives, even in our, contemporary novelistic era. And indeed, a story about a protagonist who just plows through and everything that they want to do works and is a boring story. No one can relate to that story. So it's not unfettered agency, and it's not successful agency all the time. But what we see is a quality of a person, again, sort of in the driver's seat of their life. So even when the fickle gods throw something at you, you respond proactively. That's not how the ancient Greek myths work, because they weren't writing in a novelistic mode back then. But that's how that would be sort of the contemporary analog is, of course, random awfulness is going to happen in your life. So how do you respond to it?
And the agency also, it sounds like the most productive way to think about agency to make yourself the most fulfilled in a way is that your agency is how you respond to difficulties. Right?
Absolutely, because even if we're talking about Bible and the book of Job, there is a certain asymmetry in the description, because part of it, there's a smaller part of the description of what happened and a bigger part of how Job responded to it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which in itself, I guess, is agency, even though he wasn't able to do anything.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. And just the perseverance
Yeah.
is evidence of agency.
Right.
Yeah. And in a way, then your story is, you can use the markers of it, or how you grade yourself in a sense, based on how you respond to it, not necessarily what happens externally,
Exactly.
but the fact that you've internally, done what you can.
Yes.
Is probably how you're, that would probably be the most productive way to think things through.
Yeah.
In an imperfect world.
Yes.
And once again, that's another way of personally interviewing in your own narrative.
Yes, I think that's true. So, right. So first, the awareness that you are the narrator, not just the main character. And then second, the awareness that the way that you tell your story really matters for your mental health. And so leaning into these kinds of themes, agency, communion, redemption, not contamination, exploratory processing, those are going to be tools that people can use.
When we tell our stories, how much do we let other people, we were talking about this last night, about the idea that maybe one of the beautiful things about sitting around a family dinner is everyone's telling their story. And in a way, you're also getting co-narrators that have your best interest at heart, right? So we're all telling a story. A, we get this communal story in the end. And B, we have these hopefully good intentioned, well-meaning people that are also helping you tell your story. How important, well, A, do you like that idea? And B, how important is it the kinds of people that we allow in to co-narrate our stories with us?
Oh, yeah. So we are, even though we've been talking about the individual as the narrator of their lives, our lives are fundamentally co-narrated, right? We've already talked a little bit about the way they're co-narrated in the broad cultural sense, but also by our parents and caregivers. And yeah, I also like to hope that these could be well-intentioned. But the truth is, our family members are characters in our stories, in addition to being the narrator of their stories. And sometimes there's friction between those stories. I think, I imagine a lot of people have had the experience of going home for the holidays as an adult and feeling like, oh, I'm still seen like I was as a teenager. Like my story has evolved. Why are they still seeing me the way they used to see me? And that's because adolescent you is still a character in your parents or your siblings or your cousins' stories. And if you aren't in regular touch with them, they haven't updated those stories. So our stories are fundamentally co-narrated, both by the other individuals in our lives and in our broad culture. And so I do think we have a responsibility to the people in our close lives to be generous audiences, willing to receive their stories and update their stories as they update them. And also a responsibility to put our own stories out into the world, especially stories that open up narrative options for people that might otherwise feel stifled by the dominant cultural narratives. Right. Like the only ways in which the dominant cultural narrative changes is by individual people putting out alternative narratives. We think about narrative as the nexus between self and society, right? That the medium of self and the medium of society is both narrative. And so the only way to change those broad cultural narratives is by putting out alternative personal narratives.
And that's also, I guess, that goes to the idea of the concept of you are the average of the 5 people you associate with the most, and they become your core narrative as well, and you for them as well. So
for sure,
that's very interesting. And then we expand these concentric circles to include cultural, societal.
Right. And those intimate interpersonal connections exist in broader cultural contexts.
Right.
So, who's around you will determine whether the story of your gender identity, for example, is validated or not.
Right. And I guess, there's so many negatives to the internet, but I suppose one positive is that if you do have a narrative that doesn't fit your immediate, you grew up in Iowa and you feel, you can find narratives that you can relate with, and that can help enhance your own narrative.
I think that is one of the great benefits of the internet, is that it broadens the narrative ecology dramatically. And the other thing is there's a sort of an affiliated line of research on what's called the function of fiction. And the question is, like, why would we as a species be drawn to stories that we know are not true? And the answer is because it broadens our repository of storylines, right? Like, my kids know what Quidditch is, even though it didn't exist before J.K. Rowling took her own autobiographical memory and said, like, oh, what if I put flying together with brooms? And,
Right.
and now it's a
Yeah.
thing. And now it's a thing that exists in my children's life, even though they haven't experienced it firsthand.
Right.
So if our memory is a repository and a tool for us to make sense of what's happening to us now and what might happen in the future, things like fiction, but also finding other narratives online, broaden our toolbox.
Yeah. Something that we were talking about last night too was the idea that sometimes when you think of a narrative that's particularly toxic to yourself, let's say, there's a lot of obviously emotion. I mean, that's part of the problem. There's so much emotion that gets in the way, and we were wondering how you can work through that. And one of the thoughts was with post-traumatic stress disorder, they've given people beta blockers, like things to calm them down,
Sure.
and then replay those memories, and
Right.
that's helped them. And we were wondering, have people played with, or do you think it's a good idea to play with the idea of meditation, breathing exercises, beta blockers, Valium, doing different things to help people, physiologically calm down and then run through those narratives?
Right. Well, so it's interesting when it comes to, so you're right so I did my clinical residency at the VA, working mostly with patients coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan at the time with PTSD.
Yeah.
And indeed, the sort of frontline empirically supported treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder these days mostly involve retelling the story of the trauma over and over. That it's basically an exposure therapy, but it's
Right.
an imaginal exposure therapy. And what that does is allow you to decouple the sort of hyperactivated physiology of your body with the experience, whatever the traumatic experience was. So some people need other tools to lower to lower their physiology just so they can do the first step. And absolutely, then I'm all for it, right? Like whatever you need to do to be able to access the treatment, go for it. The interesting thing is the research on exposure therapy suggests that if you don't have an elevated physiological
Ah.
response, the exposure doesn't work. You have to actually see your heart racing and your palms sweating to be able to do the psychological decoupling. You need to say, my heart racing and my palm sweating does not mean that I am in danger. And so without
Just
some physiological reactivity, the exposure actually doesn't work. So what you want to do is lower people's physiological activation
to
enough
answer
that
it.
they can engage, but
Mm.
then you want to sort of wean them out of any kind of biological or behavioral intervention so that they
Right.
can take the advantage
Yeah.
of actually experiencing the arc of their physiology go up and then go down.
And do you think it's true too, then, with the going through the narrative that you're trying to work through, even if it's not post-traumatic, but do you think it's still true, it still holds true that you need to feel that
That's a
physiological
good
reaction?
question. I mean, there's certainly no research that I know of on that question, whether if you're just working on revising your narrative, you need physiological activation. I don't know.
Yeah,
My gut is that it's not required in the same way
because it's more
because
neuroplasticity, right?
the central problem in PTSD is this like
Physiologic, yeah.
faulty physiological reaction.
Right.
Right. I had a client who had been through real combat trauma in Iraq and happened to live next to the elevated train in Chicago.
Sure.
Every time a train went by, he would have this huge physiological response. And what we needed to do was decouple the physiological response from that sensation of being transported back into combat.
Right.
I think if you were working through other parts of your narrative that you could do it. I mean, we're always embodied creatures, so I wouldn't want to, completely dull people's physiology, but I don't know that it's required in the same way because it's not the central
Yeah,
dysfunction.
and it seems like if you could calm yourself, maybe just meditation, right? That's
Yeah, oh, yeah,
or exercise, and after the
for
exercise,
sure.
then it allows you to be sort of a third eye looking at your
Yes,
experience
exactly.
better, which
Exactly.
then lets you process it differently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For sure, if it's going to enable you to engage in the work to
Yeah.
calm your physiology, then I think that's a great tool.
So another thing that we were talking about is in the context of PTSD, there's ongoing research of the role of psychedelics.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts in the
I
context?
don't have thoughts. I haven't followed I know that literature exists and I don't know much about it.
Fair enough.
So, I
Okay.
mean,
Yeah. But
off the cuff, my guess is that it's giving people really new experience, powerful physiological experiences to narrate. Um,
okay. Okay.
and that's as much as I know about that.
That's fair. Okay.
Do you think that as you get better, there was we talked with a former Navy SEAL, Tom Shea, and he talks about self-talk and the importance of how you talk to yourself in the moment. And we were thinking about if as you get better at narrating your past, I wonder if that translates into narrating your present better so that you can stay in the moment and give yourself more positive feedback.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Again, I don't know that there's research to answer that question, but I do think about the stories that we tell about our past as a lens through which we make meaning of new experiences,
Hmm.
like we talked about in
Yeah.
the health study. Um, and so I don't know what happens for people in the moment in terms of self-talk. I haven't ever collected data on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if shifting people's lens about the past gives them a
Yes.
tool for making sense of
Yeah.
unfolding events.
Right, both because you change the lens and you get a better vocabulary maybe for it.
Yes, right.
Grad students, we are dropping all these little
I
little
know.
journals for them. There was a study in in another book we were reading that it said that when two cars collide, depending on how you that's what it was. They showed people pictures
Ah,
of two cars of two cars that had an accident, and depending on the language that they used for
yes,
that picture, if they said that they
right.
collided,
This is Loftus and Palmer, 1974. It's
oh,
a
there you go.
classic.
Okay, so you know it better. Maybe you could tell better.
Yes.
'Cause
So yeah, so everyone saw the same video of a car
it's a
accident,
video.
and then
Okay.
they ask you how fast was the red car going when it blank the blue car, and they offer people different verbs. So it might be contacted versus smashed, and yeah, people report I'm not going to get it exactly right. A huge range of miles per hour, even though everyone saw the same
Yeah.
car accident. And then they asked them a week later, remember that video you watched? We forgot to ask you, was there any broken glass in the
Okay.
video? And the people who got the verb smashed say yes. And the people who got the verb contacted say no, not universal.
Right.
So yes, our memory is very slippery and very suggestible, for better and for worse, right? So
Right.
when it comes to eyewitness testimony, it's really a problem because eyewitnesses are very persuasive to juries and they're very unreliable
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
all of us are unreliable.
Right.
Right.
And the slipperiness of our memory also allows us to engage with it, to reconstruct it in ways that might better support ourselves.
Yeah, it really shows that like this thing is happening one way or the other. Like we're telling
Right.
ourselves stories, whether you want to or not.
Exactly.
You are telling yourself stories. So if you don't take charge of that process or
And so
make
the
it
question is, are you in pursuit of some objective truth?
right,
Mm.
In which case, asking people to tell you a story about what happened is not a good tool
yeah,
for getting to some kind of objective truth, because stories are fundamentally reconstructive.
yeah, it does get into how important is the truth. I mean, that's more philosophical, right?
Yes.
It's should you be leading yourself down a path that the truth doesn't matter? Just tell yourself a nice,
Right.
a story that supports you better, and you'll be
Right.
happier in the end. But nobody really wants to do that. They probably wouldn't buy into that story anyway.
Right. No, one criteria, right? So like when we think about like what makes a good scientific hypothesis, it's testable, it's
Right.
falsifiable,
Right.
right? Those are the wrong questions to ask about a story.
Yeah.
What makes a good story is not that it's testable or falsifiable, right? What makes a good story? There are a bunch of criteria for a story, but one of them, the jargony word is verisimilitude, which means like we believe that there is a correspondence between the story that you're telling us and what quote unquote really happened.
Right.
So on my residency, one of the other clinics I worked in was people with quite active psychotic disorders who tell stories that are very low in verisimilitude,
Mm.
right? That like,
And they're
you
fine
know,
with that.
the police are after me and they're sending me messages through the TV at the commercial breaks,
Right.
falls apart as a story, even though it might be coherent.
Right.
It falls apart as a story because we don't believe it. It
Yeah.
lacks correspondence to the real world. Whereas if you're like an international spy, then maybe we do believe you're getting coded messages from the TV or whatever.
Right.
So,
Right.
So, yeah, we don't want people to fabricate their lives,
Yeah.
but we also, and people rarely fabricate their lives. And at the same time, we're always reconstructing our lives.
That was
So
something
what
that was so interesting to me, that people's narrative of their past changes as time goes on, but the themes stay the same.
Yes, exactly. Themes are more stable. And it's because we're narrating the past to serve a psychological function in the present. So there's this wonderful study by Ruth Ellen Josselson. It's a single case study. She interviewed this woman every 10 years for 40 years. And she first interviewed her as a college student. And this is a white woman who was dating a black man at the time, and her parents really disapproved. And that her story is very much about, what it means to her to have this relationship, even though her parents don't approve. 10 years later, she's not together with this boyfriend anymore. The story um, takes on a very, 10 years later, she's married to someone else. She's now a parent. And the story of her relationship from college is about what kind of parent she wants to be. 10 years later, the story doesn't even show up in her narrative. And then 10 years later, it shows up again to sort of mark the passage of time and who she's been over the course of her life.
Yeah.
Same event, same relationship, plays a different narrative role at different moments in our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's an element that is just very therapeutic, just being aware of it. Just
Yeah.
being aware that we have a story, and then also when we're talking to someone else, that is their story, and it's not the realities clashing perhaps right now, but it's the stories that are clashing.
And those stories really matter. So Dan McAdams, who's sort of the pioneer in this field, his first book was called The Stories We Live By. Actually, it was his second book. And right, they are reconstructions and interpretations, but they're really important ones to us. We live by these stories. So even though, your story and my story of the same thing might be different from each other, neither of us has the premium on truth. And we're both telling the story that we need to tell to serve some psychological purpose at the moment.
Something that, as you were talking about the theme staying the same, that really, I'm really curious about. I doubt it's been done, but maybe we can throw it out to a grad student.
Right.
You followed the people in therapy, and they started to change their narrative, and they're working through it, talking with other people. I wonder if you just put people on an antidepressant and you change their physiology, I wonder if that starts to change their narrative as well.
Yeah, right. Nobody has done that particular study. So there are studies about other aspects of personality change when people are on antidepressants. And we do see some like basic dispositional trait change.
Wait, but here it's about how you're processing information.
Right,
So in therapy,
right.
you're talking it through, so you're getting
Right.
some coaching in that.
That's right.
But here
And
it's
some
just, well,
people,
because you would imagine that happier people probably more intrinsically tell more optimistic, agency-filled stories, whereas depressed people probably tend to do
yeah.
otherwise. So you know what I mean? So like, are we changing the depression, and that's then changing
Well,
the...
so in that study, I can say no. Well, no one in that sample, as far as I remember, was on antidepressants, but we did run the models in both ways. So we did not find that people whose mental health trajectory went up first went on to tell different kinds of stories.
Okay, yeah. So in a way, you would think then that maybe it doesn't work with...
So again,
That's
this
got to be
was
run. You don't know.
it was not an experiment. We did not
Yeah.
randomly assign people to tell certain kinds of stories. It was naturalistic.
Right.
In that study, we did not find that
Yeah.
changes in mental health preceded
Yeah.
changes in well-being. But it is possible, and I'm just trying to think. I don't believe there are any studies with medication, but there are longitudinal studies where we collect people's stories over time without any intervention. So I'm part of a team that's worked on a 10-year longitudinal study where we have people's life stories at year 1, 5, and 10.
That's really cool.
And we do see changes in them, and those changes being associated with well-being.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Can we return to the cultural? Is that a good time to return to cultural?
Yeah.
We wanted to get back to the cultural, the idea, because we love you talked about the idea that America loves a redemption story. America
Yeah.
is a redemption story. And I think
For some
that
people,
for some people,
for the people who get to write history.
yeah, well, and I was going to say, when I was growing up, that certainly was the prevailing winds that you felt. It's like, this is, you might be down, but if you work really hard, you'll be able to pick yourself up, et cetera. And it seems like there's, of late, the last maybe decade or two, there's much more of a tendency to have more of a victim narrative that
Mhm.
that you start to see. And whenever I see that victim narrative creeping in, wherever it creeps in, even when it might be real, right? It doesn't mean that victim narrative can exist in someone who's a victim, right?
Yep.
But the narrative still robs that person of agency, and then culturally, or it can anyway, right? It can
Well,
make
it's
it
funny.
feel
I
like
was going to say
they're
it robs them of redemption, but it might actually give them agency, right? It may make them feel like I'm taking control over this story. I'm not happy with the story that's
if
been
you do,
told.
right.
I'm
I
doing it,
yeah,
right?
unless you tell someone that you just don't have it, like there is, it depends on, I guess, on how the victim narrative
Yeah.
is played out. If you tell them, look, there's no way that you're ever going to get ahead because of X, you
Right.
don't even bother, and you say, well, okay, that's what it is.
Right.
Then that's one. For example, I was saying to Zinovy last night that my grandfather came over from Eastern Europe. We're Jewish, and he put himself through night school by working in a used furniture store to become a lawyer. And he got out with his law degree, and nobody at that time, ironically, was hiring Jews as lawyers in New York. Ironic, I say now
Yep.
because, um, but that's not really the story that I was told, right? That was the beginning of the story. The
Yeah.
bracket doesn't end there. The bracket is, so they made the used furniture business work, and they, clawed a lower middle class living and kept on going upwards. And that's the redemption narrative that I was always kind of, told, and that really infiltrated into me as this is what this is how you move through the world. I don't know. How do you see the state of the
Yeah.
narrative in the country, the world,
Well,
etc.?
so I have a close colleague who's a historian of science and technology. And apparently, in that field, there's this principle called Kranzberg's first law. And Kranzberg's first law is technology is not positive, technology is not negative, technology is not neutral, right?
Okay.
Technology is going to have an impact, but it's not always going to have a positive or a negative impact. So, but it's going to have an impact.
Yeah.
And I really think about stories that way too. Stories are not positive or negative. They exist in some context, and that's the only way you can evaluate whether they're good or bad, but they're not neutral. Stories are powerful. And so, yes, so that redemptive narrative is the dominant cultural American narrative. There's a wonderful book by Dan McAdams, who I mentioned, called The Redemptive Self: Stories Americans Live By. And in that book, he interweaves a study of midlife adults with the sort of grand sweep of American history and demonstrates how prevalent this redemptive story has been. And indeed, when I assign students to go out and find redemption, it's the easiest homework assignment I ever give because it's everywhere. It's in rom-coms, it's in ads,
Hmm.
it's, I mean, like it, you trip over yourself to find redemption. Um, and redemption is not all good or bad. So redemption tends to go along with positive well-being, but it's not always positive. Some people, the dominant cultural narratives don't feel accessible to them. Like, I can't tell this story of how my family, immigrated to the United States and everything got better from there on. That's not accurate. That's not what happened in my family. And so
Although,
what
can
I
I
was,
interject for 1 second?
yeah, please.
I mean, couldn't it seems to me that as we're thinking about how to tell a more, productive narrative for oneself, in that story where someone says, I can't tell that redemptive story for me. That's not my truth, right? But it seems like the thing to try to get people to see then is that, well, no. That is your story. You're just not, you're bracketing it too soon. You need to look to the future because that's how, because otherwise, then where's the agency, right? But if you can tell someone, look, it's dark now. Maybe there are winds. Maybe there's a lot of headwinds that you have in front of you. But this is the down. Every story, the hero is down before they're up.
Yeah.
It seems like that's the message you want to sell anyway.
I don't feel super comfortable actually making that recommendation. I do see what you're saying, right? Like that
Yeah.
that helping people see that when they're down, there's hope.
Right.
I'm all for that. Hope.
Yeah.
Hope, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Agency and redemption, maybe. Again, stories play out in a cultural context. And yes, the national context is sort of the broadest cultural context, but people exist within all kinds of communities within dominant cultures. And redemption might not be the right story for all of those cultural contexts. So it's not agency and redemption for everyone all the time. Um, I think there are alternatives, some of those alternatives are things like exploratory processing, right? Like, it really sucks to be a member of your persecuted social group right now. Maybe happiness is not the thing you're shooting for. And I think a lot of the cultural discourse right now is about meaning making, right? How can it be?
Well, wait a second though, but even the meaning making is a redemptive story in a way,
It
isn't it?
can be.
Because by grabbing onto that meaning, you're making that misery into something productive and powerful, which in and of itself, it might not lead to happiness, it might
Yes,
not lead
that's
to wealth, but it's a redemptive because there's a positive that
yes, I think that's
you're
fair to
pulling
say.
out of the
meaning.
fire.
You're people
The meaning,
out of it.
but
Yes.
the meaning is what we're all searching for anyway. I mean, in some ways, right? Like I used to say in medical school, people would say, "Are you happy?" I'm like, I'm not having fun.
Right.
I'm sorry. They would say like, "Are you having fun?" Is it like, no, I'm not having fun, but I'm happy. I know that what I'm doing is what I'm meant to be doing, so I'm happy that I'm doing it. And in the same
Yeah.
way, that's the redemptive story. I feel like I don't know. You see that?
I think it can be in that way. I wouldn't want to prescribe any particular thematic arc for everyone
Sure.
because stories are cultural products. And so I wouldn't want to say, like, I know the answer to what kinds of stories you should be telling in your cultural context. And I think there are, again, we started out by saying so much of the scientific research is in a, a Western context. I think there are lots of storylines that don't permeate the American cultural conversation that are really useful indigenous story forms that don't conform to these dominant Western themes. I don't know what they all are.
Yeah.
But so I'm a scientific journal editor, and we have an editorial fellow working us who works at the university in Ghana, and those kinds of stories that people tell in Ghana about their lives are very different than
Sure.
the one academics in Ghana are telling different stories about their lives than academics in the United States. And one is not better than the other. And I don't know enough about the Ghanaian context. And no one has done the empirical research in that context to help us understand what's the best fit story for this kind of context. But if we think about narratives as tools of adaptation in the evolutionary sense,
Yeah.
right? Then adaptation is about goodness of fit between the organism and their context.
Sure.
So in the American context, yeah, redemption's good for you if you can tell that kind of story. And if you can't, it's kind of a double whammy. I mean, I think all the time about a series of patients with really significant cancer that I've worked with at Health Story Collaborative who say, there's a really dominant storyline of cancer. Cancer showed me how strong I am. Cancer showed me how much people in my life love me in a way that I never would have known. And people who say, like, there's nothing good about my cancer. Cancer did not show me how strong I am. I'm freaking strong. I knew that without cancer. Thank you very much. Right? That's not. So they experience this double whammy of I have this illness and I'm not telling a story that people want to hear about this illness.
Right.
So I think we need to broaden the narrative ecology so that other kinds of stories are equally viable rather than trying to impose dominant storylines that have shown up in the empirical Western scientific literature on all contexts.
If we think about this from the societal standpoint, and if we think back to how we started this conversation about the cognitive revolution that made us a cohesive species and then propagated, etc. How important is it to have a cohesive, to some extent, cohesive narrative for a country to stay as a whole country and not become fragmented?
I think both with individuals and with nations, we need a certain amount of coherence. And that amount of coherence is not 100 on the 0 to 100 scale, right?
Sure.
Like a 100% coherent story is a dictatorship, right? You better tell this story.
Right.
This is the story. So it's not 100, but it's not 10 either. It's somewhere in the middle. And we need that for our own lives too, right? Our lives are very incoherent. So the narration of our lives imposes coherence on them in a way that is psychologically productive, but also glosses over the complexity of our daily lives. And there's a certain amount of that that's really adaptive, and too much of it probably gets in the way of you really paying attention to what's happening in your life. Same for countries.
Yeah. Because I mean, you think back to Civil War and kind of the divergence of the narratives
Oh, yeah.
between the South and the North, and thinking, where was that breaking point where the narrative started to separate, and was there a point in time where we could have pivoted and combined those narratives? And then, of course, some historians will say that America is the way it is, not despite the Civil War, but rather because of the Civil War, because that created a more cohesive.
And
world.
again, I think we've had this really interesting sort of dance with truth as we've been talking, right? It's like the truth of slavery is not a narrative inconvenience, right? It is a historical abomination. No narrative would have made it better.
Right.
So, right, there is a role. Narrative is not everything.
Right. Of course.
Yeah, it's really interesting how either with something like just, slavery or someone with cancer, it's like there are some things that are just terrible. And
Yes. Redemption is wrong.
but it's yeah.
I mean, certainly there's been this discussion, right, in the Florida public schools. They're supposed to teach that some slaves benefited from their experience of enslavement. That's horrifying, right? That may be true.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that the idea, put that aside for the moment. There's just the idea that out of, on the one hand, you have to make room for people to be able to just say, this sucks. And sometimes that's the best thing you can do, as you know, with someone who's going through something terrible, is just sit there, hold their hand and say, yes, it does. I am so sorry. This sucks.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think to the extent that it's reasonable or possible to have your eye on some kind of redemptive narrative, you want to give people access to that, because ultimately it would probably behoove them if they can get there. Even, it's like, it's a really interesting, I feel like it's like dancing on the tip of the pin, where
for
it's
me,
really
it's
hard to know.
It's distinguished between hope and redemption, right? Redemption to me implies like a positive conclusion that makes all the bad worth it. Whereas hope is the belief that good things can still happen, even though things are terrible right now. And hope seems unquestionably to be a good thing. I don't know what the benefit of hopelessness would be, but redemption is a very particular type of hope.
But I would encourage you maybe to think of redemption maybe with less all or nothing, right? Like sometimes you can pull something out.
For sure.
Was it worth it? Nope, wasn't worth it. But did you pull something good out? You did pull something good out, right? That kind of yeah. No, it's a really interesting. That's a really interesting point. Jonathan, thank you so much. You've been really generous with your time. This has been
really fun. Thank you for not just giving me the opportunity to sort of share what I know, but to like really engage here and debate some stuff. That was great.
That was fun.
There's some of these things I'm going to have to go back and watch this to think about some of the things and that logos. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Friends, thank you for your attention. We hope you've enjoyed the conversation. If you find value, please remember to hit the like button, help us with our YouTube algorithm. Consider subscribing to the channel and turn on the notifications so you can stay up to date with everything going on with the channel. And please leave us a comment. Let us know what you thought about the show and also what you'd like to hear about in the future.